Foreign ministers from the Group of 7 nations are meeting in London in their first face-to-face discussions in 2 years. Russia and China are big on the agenda.
Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab sees a scope for even greater international cooperation as foreign ministers of the G7 countries gather in London on Monday.
But what matters to us most is that we're broadening the caucus, the international caucus of like-minded countries that stand up for open societies, human rights and democracy, that stand up for open trade, that want to get to the bottom of how this pandemic started.
It's their first in-person meeting since the COVID-19 pandemic began. The UK holds the group's rotating presidency this year. Monday's meeting is kicking off a week of diplomacy aimed at reinvigorating G7's role. Among the topics are pandemic recovery, vaccine distribution, climate change, and how to deal with Russia and China.
In all of these areas, we want to be absolutely firm and standing shoulder to shoulder, not just with Americans, as important as they are, but also with our wider allies. That's why the G7 is so important.
Britain has identified Russia as the biggest threat to its security, though it views China as the greatest long-term challenge, militarily, economically and technologically.
We want a constructive relationship with China, but on things, whether it's intellectual property theft or standing up for human rights in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, obviously we're going to be very clear on our values, and on Russia as well.
The G7 members are Britain, the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan. Their combined gross domestic product is about $40 trillion, a little less than half of the global economy. The UK has also invited ministers from Australia, India, South Africa and South Korea this week. The ministers will lay groundwork for the G7 summit in Cornwall next month.
Loved ones will be able to attend funerals in England without the 30-person limit from the 17th of May. The easing goes beyond the scheduled roadmap.
The government will remove the legal limit of 30 mourners for funerals in England by the 17th of May. That's for both indoor and outdoor venues. The total capacity will be determined by how many people venues can safely accommodate. Places of worship or funeral homes still need to follow social distancing rules and other guidelines. Communities Secretary Robert Jenrick said on Monday, "Losing a loved one has been incredibly hard during the pandemic, and I am pleased that we are now in a position, thanks to everyone's continued efforts and the rollout of the vaccine, to remove these limits." The National Association of Funeral Directors welcomed the move. Its chief executive John Levitt said, "It's critical that all those who are grieving are not forgotten in the reopening of society." The government says that limits for other life commemorative events are expected to remain as set out in the roadmap.
New data out says after 2 decades of growth, the rental market is stalling. Nationwide's chief economist says the private rental market is unusually uncertain. NTD's Patrick Hayden takes a look.
The private rental market is unusually uncertain in the wake of COVID-19. That's after 2 decades of growth. Mortgage Works, the buy-to-let arm of Nationwide, carried out a review. Chief economist Robert Gardner says as well as enormous uncertainty, there is also the scope the pandemic will have profound effects on housing demand in the years ahead. Data from the Rental Market Review says household renting in England fell for the 3rd year in a row in 2020. In 2020, it was 18.7%, and in 2019, it was 19.3%. There was a 12% drop in rental house ownership between 2017 and 2020. The review asked 3,000 renters at the end of April if they were considering moving, and 40% said yes. Renters in London are most likely to relocate. Patrick Hayden, NTD News London.
All lockdown measures are expected to be lifted on the 21st of June. Hospitality emphasises that a return to unrestricted trading is critical for pubs and restaurants across the country.
On Sunday, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab asked the public to remain patient until all lockdown measures are lifted.
Actually, that 21st of June, 4th step out of lockdown is not far away now. So I think if we just hang on, keep being guided by the science and the evidence, measure the progress we're making carefully, we're nearly there.
But industry body UK Hospitality stressed that any restrictions in venues will impact revenue and business viability. Its chief executive says a return to unrestricted trading on June 21st is critical and will mean hospitality businesses can come off life support and be viable for the first time in almost 16 months. The UK Cinema Association also said that it hopes face coverings will no longer be required in their venues.
Communist China bans or restricts foreign investors from taking stakes in its critical infrastructure or high-tech industries. But it is investing heavily in the UK's critical infrastructure.
According to an investigation by the Times newspaper, Chinese and Hong Kong investors have quietly brought up UK assets worth £134 billion, from Britain's critical infrastructures, blue-chip companies to healthcare, schools and technology. The investigation finds at least £44 billion of purchases were from Chinese state-owned entities, with huge investments going into the energy sector. Chinese state-owned China General Nuclear has a 33.5% stake in Hinkley Point C power station in Somerset. This company also plans to join France's EDF to take a 20% stake at Sizewell C in Suffolk and intends to take a majority stake at a third UK nuclear power plant at Bradwell in Essex. China's sovereign wealth fund, China Investment Corporation, has a 49% stake at Neptune Energy. This state-controlled fund also has a 10.5% stake at Cadent Gas, the UK's biggest gas distribution company, and a 10% stake at Heathrow Airport. According to research firm Argus Vickers, Chinese and Hong Kong companies or private investors have shares that value nearly £57 billion in FTSE 100 companies, with nearly half of HSBC owned by Chinese investors in shares worth more than £42 billion. Some Chinese investors are also betting on science. For example, Chinese tech giant Tencent invests in Oxford Nanopore, a gene sequencing company, and an investment service company owned by a state-owned China construction bank invests in Immunocore, an Oxfordshire-based cancer specialist company. Besides these state companies and funds, some private investors have also brought up UK infrastructure. Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing has invested tens of billions in the UK over the last 11 years. To name a few, his family now owns UK Power Networks, Northumbrian Water and train lease company Eversholt. He also brought up the UK's largest pub retailer and brewer, Greene King. The former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith tells The Times, China poses the single greatest strategic threat to the UK and the free world. He says the investigation shows that the UK is dangerously sailing towards Chinese control of key aspects of its business. Former Prime Minister David Cameron and ex-Chancellor George Osborne had tried to forge closer ties with Beijing in what they called a golden era. Research associate at Oxford University's China Centre, George Magnus, says Cameron and Osborne were chronically naive.
Ofcom is warning people not to trust the caller ID displayed on their phones, as fraudsters can appear to be calling from any number.
Criminals are using software to have your phone display whatever number they want. The practice is called number spoofing. Ofcom says fraudsters often pose as representatives of banks or credit card companies to get people to reveal sensitive information. Britain's telecoms watchdog warns not to rely upon the caller ID as the sole means of identification, and that people should never give out personal information in response to incoming calls. A director at Ofcom told the BBC the problem is global in its scope. He adds that the UK is behind other countries such as the US in tackling the problem. Banking industry body UK Finance says scammers stole around £480 million in 2020 through fraudulent transactions.
Now, we all know the Royal Marines are heroes, but did you know some can actually fly like superheroes? New footage shows just that. How do you take control of an enemy ship at sea? Existing methods, such as using a helicopter, are slow and vulnerable. So the Royal Marines have been testing how to speed up such an operation with Jetsuits. A Marine wearing the suit can land on the ship and then hook a caving ladder to permit assaulting personnel access. Developer Gravity Industries says the suit will bring about a revolution in tactical capability for many special forces. Still to come, after more than 6 months closure, bars and restaurants in Paris are gearing up to reopen in 2 weeks' time. That and more when we return.